I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the sold sign staked into my front yard. I nearly dropped my grocery bags right there in the driveway. My house, my property, had just been sold, and I sure as hell hadn't been the one to sell it. I stormed up to the sign, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of prank or mistake, but then I saw the paperwork taped to my front door, a notice of sale. And at the bottom, in big, bold letters, was the name of the buyer, Granite Ridge Developments. A real estate developer. My blood boiled. There was only one person in this neighborhood shady enough to pull something like this: Karren Whitmore, the HOA president. A middle-aged control freak with an obsession for beautifying the neighborhood, which really just meant getting rid of anyone she didn't like. And I had been at the top of that list ever since I refused to repaint my house in one of her approved colors. I ripped the notice off my door and marched straight to the HOA office, my hands clenched into fists. Karren sat behind her oversized mahogany desk, sipping tea like she didn't have a care in the world. "Ah, Victoria," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I was wondering when you'd come by. You sold my house," I snapped, slamming the notice onto her desk. Karren didn't even flinch. She just gave me that smug little smile she always had when she thought she was in control. "Technically, the HOA sold your property. You were delinquent on your HOA dues, and per the bylaws, we had the authority to reclaim it." I stared at her, stunned. I've never missed a payment in my life. "Oh, but you did," she said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "We sent you multiple notices about late fees and outstanding citations. You failed to respond, so we exercised our rights." I yanked open the folder and scanned the documents. It was a mess of fabricated fines, things like failure to maintain lawn height and non-compliance with community aesthetic standards. All bogus. All designed to rack up thousands in fake penalties. "You're lying," I hissed. "This is fraud." Karren leaned back in her chair, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "Call it what you want, but the sale has already gone through. The developer plans to demolish the house next month. I'm sure they'll be happy to discuss a buyout if you want to purchase your property back at their price, of course." I could feel my fingers shaking. She had orchestrated this entire thing just to get rid of me, and she thought I was powerless to stop her. She was dead wrong. I didn't waste another second arguing with her. I turned on my heel and walked out, my mind already racing through my next move. Karren thought she could steal my home and get away with it. She was about to learn just how badly she had underestimated me. The moment I stepped out of the HOA office, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The first number I dialed was my lawyer, Ethan Reynolds. He had helped me before when the HOA tried to fine me over a garden gnome they claimed was too whimsical for the neighborhood aesthetic. If anyone could unravel this mess, it was him. Ethan picked up on the second ring, and the moment I explained what had happened, he let out a low whistle. "They sold your house without your consent. That's not just shady, that's outright illegal," he said. "Meet me at my office in 30 minutes. Bring every document they gave you." I didn't waste any time. I drove straight to Ethan's downtown law office, my hands gripping the wheel tight. By the time I arrived, he had already cleared his desk and was waiting with a legal pad in hand. I spread out the HOA's so-called paper trail across his desk, and he flipped through it with the practiced eye of someone who had dismantled more than a few fraudulent schemes. His brow furrowed as he scanned the pages. "These fines don't even make sense," he muttered. "They're inconsistent, and some of these supposed violations don't exist in the HOA bylaws." He tapped one of the pages. "Look at this one: failure to maintain a driveway free of unapproved vehicles. That's not even enforceable. And these late fees. They stack up in a way that's mathematically impossible." I leaned forward. "So what's our move?" Ethan's lips curled into something that looked dangerously close to amusement. "We hit them where it hurts. First, I'll file an emergency motion to halt the sale. If we can prove fraud, the entire transaction becomes void and ownership reverts back to you. A surge of hope rushed through me. And then, he picked up a pen and started jotting notes. Then we take them to court. If we can prove the HOA engaged in fraudulent financial practices, we can sue them for damages. Not just for the fraudulent sale, but for emotional distress, legal fees, and any other damages we can tack on. He looked up at me. If we do this right, we won't just get your house back. We'll take a chunk out of their budget so deep, they won't recover for years. The thought of taking them down filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan wasted no time filing the emergency motion. Within hours, a judge issued a temporary injunction, halting any further action on the sale. That meant the developer couldn't proceed with demolition or take legal ownership until the case was resolved. Karren, of course, was furious. The very next morning, I found her waiting outside my home, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're making a mistake," she said the moment I stepped out onto my porch. I met her gaze without flinching. "No, Karren, you made the mistake when you thought you could steal my home and get away with it." Her expression hardened. "You're only dragging this out unnecessarily. The HOA followed its rules to the letter. Your so-called lawsuit is just a waste of everyone's time and money." I folded my arms. "If that's true, then you have nothing to worry about, do you?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She knew she had overplayed her hand, and now she was scrambling to regain control. But it was too late for that. The next few weeks were a flurry of legal proceedings. Ethan subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, and what we found was even worse than I imagined. The HOA had been systematically inflating fines and fees for years, using them as a revenue stream to fund unnecessary projects and, in some cases, personal expenses. Karren had been funneling money into maintenance costs that didn't exist. The paper trail was damning. Ethan grinned when he laid it all out in front of me. "Not only do we have fraud, but we have embezzlement. This isn't just a civil case anymore. This could turn criminal." That was when the real fun began. Court day arrived, and the HOA's legal team looked tense. Karren sat at the defense table, her normally pristine composure cracking at the edges. Ethan presented the evidence with relentless precision, dismantling every excuse the HOA's attorney tried to offer. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Ethan called a forensic accountant to the stand, someone he had hired to analyze the HOA's records. The accountant confirmed that money had been misallocated, payments had been falsified, and funds had been siphoned into unapproved expenditures. The judge's expression darkened as the testimony unfolded. When Ethan finally rested our case, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Then the ruling came down. The sale was declared fraudulent and reversed immediately. Ownership of my home was restored, and the HOA. They weren't just ordered to pay back every cent they had wrongfully taken from residents. They were also slapped with a massive fine that effectively drained their budget dry. As I walked out of the courtroom victorious, Karren came storming after me, her face flushed with fury. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You've ruined this community. Without our budget, we can't maintain anything." I turned to her, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "No, Karren, I didn't ruin this community, you did, and now everyone knows it." She had no response to that. She just stood there, speechless, as the weight of her defeat settled in. By the time the dust settled, the HOA was forced to disband. Without funds, they couldn't enforce their rules or operate at all. The neighborhood finally got what it needed: freedom from Karren's iron grip. And as for me, I still had my home. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. With the court ruling in my favor and the HOA effectively dismantled, I expected Karren to slink away in disgrace. But I should have known better. People like her never admit defeat, they just look for new ways to manipulate the situation. The first sign that she wasn't done came a week after the ruling. A group of former HOA board members gathered outside my house, whispering amongst themselves. When I stepped onto my porch, they scattered, but not before I caught snippets of their conversation talk of rebuilding, of getting back what was lost. They were already scheming to reinstate the HOA under a new name. Ethan had warned me that something like this might happen. When people like Karren lost control, they didn't just accept it. They regrouped, revised their tactics, and tried again. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the next few days reaching out to my neighbors, the ones who had suffered under the HOA's rule. Many of them were still wary, afraid that fighting back would just bring more trouble. But when I explained what Karren and her cronies were planning, something shifted. I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. There were families who had been fined into near bankruptcy, elderly residents who had been harassed over minor infractions, and small business owners who had been forced to shut down home operations because they didn't fit Karren's vision for the neighborhood. I organized a meeting at my house, and the turnout surprised me. More than 20 families showed up, each of them with their own horror story about how the HOA had abused its power. As we shared our experiences, the atmosphere changed from one of fear to determination. We weren't just going to stop Karren from reinstating the HOA. We were going to make sure she never had the power to do this again. Ethan helped us draft a neighborhood charter that explicitly prohibited any future HOA formation without the unanimous consent of all homeowners. We took it to the city council and lobbied for an exemption that would put our neighborhood under direct municipal governance rather than private HOA control. It wasn't an easy process. Karren tried to fight us every step of the way. She showed up at city council meetings, arguing that the integrity of the neighborhood depended on strict oversight. She rallied the few remaining residents who were still loyal to her, trying to paint us as reckless troublemakers who would let the community fall into chaos. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The financial records Ethan had exposed in court were now public knowledge, and no one was willing to trust her again. The final blow came when the city council ruled in our favor. Our neighborhood was officially removed from the HOA system and placed under standard municipal regulation. Without the legal framework to reestablish control, Karren was left with nothing. Her influence evaporated overnight. In the weeks that followed, the changes were immediate. The absurd aesthetic rules were gone, meaning people could finally paint their homes however they wanted. The ridiculous fines disappeared, and residents no longer had to live in fear of arbitrary punishments. But the best part, the money the HOA had been hoarding was redistributed back to the community. With the funds legally recovered, we used them to repair sidewalks, improve street lighting, and even set up a community garden, real improvements that benefited everyone, not just a select few. One evening, as I stood outside admiring the freshly planted flower beds in what had once been Karren's prized, uniform green space, I saw her watching from her porch. Her house, once the pristine model of HOA-approved perfection, now stuck out among the newly colorful homes. She looked lost, as if she couldn't comprehend how everything had slipped from her grasp. She didn't speak to me. She just turned and went back inside, shutting the door firmly behind her. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again, one where people looked out for each other, instead of living in fear of arbitrary rules. Karren had tried to sell my home out from under me. She had tried to crush me with fines and legal loopholes. But in the end, all she had done was destroy herself. With the HOA gone and the neighborhood free, I expected things to settle down. For the most part, they did. People started making changes to their homes, planting flowers, repainting doors, small acts of defiance that would have gotten them fined into oblivion under Karren's rule. The energy in the neighborhood shifted from tense and rigid to something far more relaxed, almost celebratory. Still, I kept an eye on Karren. She wasn't the type to go down quietly, and I had a nagging feeling she wasn't done stirring up trouble. She had lost her title, her influence, and her precious HOA, but she still had allies. A handful of residents who had benefited from her rule still clung to the idea that she could somehow regain control. They were bitter, muttering about how the community was falling apart without strict oversight. One evening, as I was watering my newly planted rose bushes, I saw one of her former board members lingering near the sidewalk. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching my house. I turned off the hose and met his gaze. He hesitated, then walked away without saying a word. It was subtle, but I knew what it meant. They were looking for an angle, a way to claw back some control. I didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. A formal complaint not from an HOA, since they no longer existed, but from a newly formed Community Improvement Committee. It had been hastily put together, clearly an attempt to recreate the HOA under a different name. The letter was full of flowery language about maintaining property values and preserving the neighborhood's character, but the real message was clear. They were trying to re-establish authority. I took the letter straight to Ethan. He barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "This has no legal standing," he said. "They can call themselves a committee all they want, but they have no enforcement power. They're just trying to intimidate people into compliance." That was exactly what I suspected, but hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. They had lost fairly in court, and now they were trying to manipulate their way back into power. Ethan leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Want to shut this down for good?" I didn't even have to think about it. He drafted a cease and desist letter, citing the court ruling and the newly established neighborhood charter. The so-called committee had no legal authority, and any attempt to impose fines, restrictions, or property regulations would be considered harassment. Ethan made it clear we were prepared to take legal action if they pushed any further. I delivered the letter myself. Karren answered the door, her expression carefully neutral, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. She took the envelope from me without a word, but she didn't close the door right away. "You think you've won," she said after a pause, her voice controlled but edged with frustration. I didn't bother responding. I had no interest in engaging in another round of her mind games. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "You don't understand how these things work, Victoria. Communities need structure. Without it, everything falls apart." I met her stare evenly. "Funny, things seem to be working just fine without your rules." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. She shut the door with a little more force than necessary, and I walked away, satisfied that she had gotten the message. But Karren wasn't the type to let things go. A few days later, I started hearing rumors. Whispers among the remaining loyalists, complaints muttered at the corner store. Karren was spreading the idea that without the HOA, the neighborhood would decline. She claimed property values were already dropping, that crime would increase, that without proper oversight, things would eventually spiral out of control. It was fear-mongering, pure and simple. And worse, some people were listening. I needed to put an end to it before it gained traction. I spent the next few weeks organizing a community meeting, an honest, open discussion about the future of the neighborhood. No HOA, no committees, just residents talking about what they wanted. I made sure the word spread, ensuring that even Karren's remaining allies knew about it. The turnout was better than I expected. People were eager to talk about what came next, how we could maintain the neighborhood without unnecessary bureaucracy. We discussed forming a volunteer group for upkeep, things like organizing cleanups, helping elderly neighbors with yard work, and pooling funds for common area maintenance. Karren showed up, of course. She lingered at the back, listening but not participating. When someone asked about security concerns, she seized the opportunity. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "Without structure, people are already worried about safety. How long before crime becomes a problem?" I didn't let her control the narrative. "This neighborhood isn't falling apart," I said, addressing the crowd directly. "We're figuring things out together, without arbitrary fines. Without someone dictating what color our doors have to be, we can take care of each other without being controlled." People nodded in agreement. The energy in the room shifted. Karren had miscalculated again. Over the next few months, the volunteer system took off. People actually enjoyed having a say in how things were maintained. The neighborhood flourished not because of rigid rules, but because people genuinely cared. And Karren, she faded into the background, her influence completely eroded. The few who still clung to the idea of reinstating strict regulations eventually gave up. The community had moved on, and there was no place for her brand of control anymore. The house she once lorded over like a queen sat unchanged while the rest of the neighborhood thrived. She had fought so hard to maintain power, but in the end, she had lost everything. And I had my home, my freedom, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. With Karren's influence reduced to nothing and the neighborhood thriving under its newfound freedom, I had expected her to finally give up. But people like her never truly accepted defeat. They just changed tactics. It started small. Strange things began happening around the neighborhood: trash cans mysteriously knocked over, sprinklers tampered with, and flyers posted on streetlights warning of declining property values and lawless streets. At first, it seemed like petty vandalism, but it was too targeted, too deliberate. Someone was trying to stir up fear. That someone was Karren. Her attempts to regain control had failed, so now she was trying to convince people they had made a mistake by dismantling the HOA. If she couldn't rule the neighborhood, she would make it miserable enough that people would beg to bring it back. I wasn't about to let that happen. I started documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my property, and I encouraged my neighbors to do the same. Within a week, we had footage of Karren sneaking around at night, pulling down community bulletin board notices, scattering trash on people's lawns, and even tampering with a neighbor's outdoor lights to make it look like the area was falling into neglect. With the evidence in hand, I took it straight to Ethan. He wasted no time drafting a formal complaint and filing for a restraining order, citing harassment and property damage. The day Karren was served the papers was the most satisfying moment yet. She had gone from the self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood to a desperate saboteur, clinging to whatever power she thought she had left. But now, with a legal order preventing her from engaging in further harassment, her last-ditch efforts had officially failed. The restraining order was just the beginning. The footage we had gathered also gave grounds for a civil lawsuit. Several neighbors joined in, filing claims for damages caused by her vandalism. Her legal fees alone were piling up, and without the HOA funds she had once relied on, she had to pay out of pocket. The financial pressure must have been unbearable because the next thing we knew, Karren's house was listed for sale. She was leaving. The day the moving trucks pulled up to her driveway, the entire neighborhood felt lighter. People gathered outside, watching as the woman who had tormented them for years packed up and left. No one said a word to her. No one offered a farewell. She had alienated everyone, and now she was leaving in disgrace. As I stood on my porch, watching her car disappear down the street, I finally felt like the battle was over. Not only had I won, but the entire neighborhood had come together to ensure that no one like Karren would ever have power over them again. Her reign was over, and we were free. With Karren gone, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. The suffocating rules that once dictated every detail of our lives had vanished, and in their place was a newfound sense of freedom. People repainted their homes in colors that suited them. Gardens flourished with plants that would have once been deemed unapproved. And neighbors actually spoke to one another without the underlying tension of HOA enforcement lurking in the background. But just because Karren had left didn't mean her mess was fully cleaned up. There were still lingering issues, financial records to sort through, legal loose ends to tie up, and a handful of loyalists who hadn't quite accepted that the HOA was dead for good. Ethan and I worked closely with the city to ensure that everything was properly transitioned. We wanted to make sure no loophole could ever allow another HOA to take root in our neighborhood again. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with the remaining HOA funds. After the lawsuit, a significant portion had been drained to pay back wrongfully collected fines and cover legal fees. But there was still a chunk left money that had been sitting in the HOA's reserves, intended for so-called beautification projects. The city had temporarily frozen the funds while the legal process played out, and now it was time to decide what to do with them. A community meeting was called to discuss how best to use the money. Without Karren's iron grip, people were eager to have a say. Suggestions ranged from park improvements to funding a neighborhood security camera system. Some wanted to use the money to repair sidewalks that had been neglected while the HOA was busy spending funds on frivolous projects. The discussion was lively, with passionate voices on all sides. But unlike the old HOA meetings, there was no fear of fines or retaliation, just neighbors coming together to make real decisions. In the end, it was agreed that the remaining funds would be split into 3 projects: repairing public walkways, upgrading community spaces, and creating an emergency assistance fund for homeowners in distress. It was poetic justice. The money that Karren had hoarded to control us would now be used to help the very people she had targeted. As the weeks passed, the changes became even more tangible. The once rigid, uniform neighborhood now had character. People began hosting block parties, something that had been banned under the old HOA rules for being disruptive. Front yards became more personalized, reflecting the unique personalities of the homeowners rather than the absurd aesthetic standards Karren had imposed. One day, as I was installing a new mailbox, one that would have definitely been out of compliance under the old regime, Ethan stopped by. He leaned against the fence, watching as I secured the post. "The neighborhood looks different," he noted. In a good way, I stood back and admired the sight. Houses that had once been near identical now had their own charm. The community garden was thriving, and kids played freely in yards without the fear that a noise complaint would be filed against them. "It feels like home again," I said. Ethan nodded, then pulled a folder from under his arm. "I've got something you might want to see." I wiped my hands off and took the papers. As I flipped through them, my eyebrows lifted in surprise. These were records from the real estate developer, the same one Karren had tried to sell my house to. Only now, the developer was facing legal trouble of their own. Turns out they weren't just colluding with Karren to acquire properties illegally, Ethan explained. They had been engaging in fraudulent development practices across multiple communities. The city is launching an investigation, so Karren's little deal wasn't just unethical, it was part of a larger scheme. "Looks like her greed finally caught up with her," I said. Ethan grinned. "And she won't be able to weasel her way out of this one." With the investigation underway, it became clear that Karren's downfall wasn't just about our neighborhood. The developer she had conspired with was now under scrutiny, and any properties acquired through shady means were being reviewed. That meant anyone who had been wrongfully pushed out of their homes had a chance to fight back. Some former homeowners who had been forced to sell under HOA pressure were now considering legal action of their own. Karren had thought she was playing the long game, but in the end, she had only set herself up for ruin. Her departure had been quiet, but her final reckoning would be anything but. As the months passed, the neighborhood continued to thrive. Without an HOA breathing down our necks, people took pride in their homes not out of fear, but because they genuinely cared. The projects funded by the reclaimed money made a real difference, and for the first time in years, there was a true sense of community. One evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm hues. The sound of laughter from a nearby gathering carried through the air, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had once dominated these streets. Ethan stopped by again, this time with a final update. It's official, he said. The city has ruled that our neighborhood is permanently exempt from any future HOA formation. I let out a long breath, feeling a weight lift entirely. No more loopholes, no more power plays. We actually did it, I said. Ethan smiled. You did it. Karren tried to take everything from you, and now she has nothing. I thought back to all the battles I had fought, the fabricated fines, the fraudulent sale, the courtroom showdown. It had been a long, exhausting fight, but in the end, justice had won. As I looked around at the thriving neighborhood, I knew one thing for certain. This was our home. And no one would ever take it from us again.